This is Guitar Business Radio, the podcast for the business of guitar. No reviews, no demos, no idle chatter, just useful dialogue and information to help you get the most out of your guitar-related business. Whether you're a guitar builder or a guitar player or just something in between, this is for you. Now, here's your host. Oh, wait, it's me, Jeffrey D. Brown. So let's get to it. Welcome to episode 19 of GBR from Guitar Business Media, the only dedicated guitar-centric business media outlet of its kind. We have another great show for you today, and we'll be joined for the full hour by Michael Stevens. You may know him as one of the original founders of the Fender Custom Shop over 30 years ago, and you've probably been seeing his extraordinary guitars in the hands of some of the greatest players on the planet for more than a couple of decades. But there's much more to his career in the business of guitar, which actually spans nearly 5 decades. Because this is a long interview, we're not going to get to anything in the shorts today, but that segment will be back next week and will include a very big piece of news that we'll be revealing at that time. So don't miss that in our milestone episode 20. One other quick thing for those of you who have been following us on our journey here. I want to just take a moment to thank those of you who participated in our Patreon experiment, which it was. After evaluating its effectiveness now for a couple of months or so, we've just decided that it's not a good fit for this show. If this were a one-off pop culture podcast with nothing else going on, it might work well, and certainly has for some. I continue to think it's a great platform, and crowdfunding is certainly here to stay, that's for sure. And because we're growing as a company and adding some other moving parts to it, it makes sense for us to pursue a different and slightly more traditional path to generate revenue to the organization. So I'll have more to say about that in the next episode of The Shorts. Some of you may find out about it a little bit sooner, but suffice to say, we will always be a work in process, which is kind of how life is, right? Now, let's get to something completely different. So without any further delay, I want to bring in our special guest on the show today. He's a very unique character who is known and worked with so many great players in the business like Stevie Ray Vaughan, Eric Johnson, Junior Brown, and so many others, just too many to mention. He was the founder of the Fender Custom Shop along with John Page, who we interviewed here just a few episodes ago. And if you've not listened to that episode yet, you'll probably want to after listening to this one. It's an amazing story, and we're going to hear all about it from the one who's lived it, as Michael Stevens joins us right here and right now. Well, Michael, thank you so much for coming on the show today. It's a real thrill. Great to have you.
Well, I'm happy to be here. I always like to talk. Out here I only got 2 cats and only one of them will listen. So,
well, we're going to talk about your landscape out there in a little bit, but you're somebody I've wanted to talk to for a long time. And of course, we've had some intermittent contact over many years. But, I always like to get started by trying to get a picture of what a business or a career is built on. I guess we call it a foundation, but usually in our early years, we establish kind of a variety of building blocks, I say, that really set the stage for us, at least initially, so that we can move ahead with our lives. So now I'm going to ask you to tell me a little bit about those years in your situation and what set the stage for you up until the point where you started your career. I know it's a mouthful, but maybe you can take a shot at it.
I'll give her a try. Well, I grew up in Ohio, which I don't know. I guess maybe some people know. But my dad was cowboy, hardcore, pretty serious cowboy. And that's too long a story to get into, but he was in West Texas from 1934 up until World War II, even though he was born in Ohio. And so I grew up as a cowboy son, me and my brother. And, at some point, he finally managed to get land and to where we could put his horses somewhere. And, I guess I'm old enough that back in those days, I can remember that the milkman in our town and the garbage man both had horse-drawn vehicles.
Oh, is that right?
Yes, I can remember that.
Well, I know it's not that long ago. It's not like in the 19th century.
But, I was born in 45, so that would have been probably when I was 4 years old, when you remember those things.
Yeah.
And I remember the Iceman bringing a block of ice into the kitchen. But that just tells you I'm an old fart.
Well, that sounds about right. I mean, I kind of grew up in the later 50s, and I remember some of that stuff. I remember the milkman. I don't think he had a horse, but I do remember the milk coming to the front door.
But eventually, after those first few years, but I know by the time I was 6, we were on a farm and had been there for a while. And Cowboy always had to have stalls and barns and arenas. And early on, he was always, back then, they didn't have ranches, so they were always going around roping arenas late at night, and 2-horse trailers and an old 88 was his preference. And then finally started buying these, what we called Yankee trucks, which were about, flatbeds, those big old trucks, and refitting them and putting side oak panels on them. And he did that a bunch when I was a kid growing up, and then he'd sell them, and then we'd have to go build another one. Because my brother and I and him, we were always hauling at least minimum 3 horses to a show. Well, that meant we had to have bigger vehicle, and so we were always doing that and building stalls and hanging lights and building fence. And
you were doing that at that time, at that age, or?
Yeah, up until, that's kind of seemed like, I got pictures of me, and we got to be 7, 8 years old, still doing, helping Dad, whatever you could do. And then,
so you were working with wood already, right?
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah, and he liked oak and bolts. We didn't nail any. Well, you couldn't hammer into oak anyway. But and feed bins and hay lofts and all kinds of stuff. And then at some point, we finally got us a pretty good place that he bought, because you could get an exemption. He started doing hay, and we tried corn, and we tried different things. And at age 12, I'm already running farm machinery and driving a tractor on the highway with a load of hay behind it in a wagon, and baling hay and taking care of everything. And back in those days, we still had a lot of horses around. I mean, Ohio, post-World War II, Ohio had more horses per capita than any state in the Union. Believe that or not, but you can look it up.
Boy, that's an interesting one. I will have to look that up maybe next year.
Well, you got the Standardbred Society there in Southern Ohio, which is the sulky racing, and they were. We had the Pacers, and the Trotters were in Pennsylvania at the Hamiltonian, and we'd always go to Little Brown Jug and watch the Pacers. And every farmer after World War II still had a team, because I can remember, 5, 6 years old, driving a team in a hayfield gathering hay because they were baling with the tractor. And probably the farmer was hollering at the horses, and I was just holding the leather reins. Who knows back then? But so I grew up doing that, and then he got me into leather work, and I started tooling belts and gun holsters, and then he got me to repairing saddles at this little saddle shop in town. And so I was always learning to fix things. And, of course, then when I got into high school, voila, we had a high school wood shop. Boy, was I in hog heaven.
I can imagine.
And my teacher, Gene Riffle, we just hit it off, and I started helping him during study halls. And eventually, as a senior in high school, I was the paid substitute teacher for wood shop and for the drafting class for Mr. Sherrick.
That's amazing.
Because I just got A's in all those classes and failed everything else. Nobody figured that one out. And, I was kind of not thinking about college much because, Dad didn't have a lot of money, and I just couldn't figure out how that would happen. I thought I was going to be the new Andrew Wyeth because I was a pencil drawer. And I loved Randy Steffen, who drew all kinds of stuff, horse pictures for Western horsemen. And so I go to Ohio State, and they beat the hell out of me with that, and wanted to give me a piece of chalk the size of a Coke bottle and draw something on a canvas bigger than my car. But while and this was Ohio State by the time I'd gotten up there and passed all this other stuff. But high school woodshop was a big influence on me. And Gene Riffle, later I got to go back and show him what I did before he died, and I think he was pleased. And I was very happy because he was a great man. But
yeah, that's cool.
So here I'm at Ohio State, and I'm trying to be, a city kid. I'm trying to dress like that. I showed up with a saddle and black hat and blue jeans, and everybody called me Stony because Stony Burke was on TV. But I'm trying to shake that and be this, different guy, which didn't work very long.
Right.
And I was playing a little bit of music. I had a guitar. I'd had one earlier, an old Craftsman and an amp, but when I was home, but nobody to teach me, so I don't know what I ever did with it other than annoying my parents.
Mm-hmm.
And by the time I'd got to college, I'd been listening to Ian and Sylvia and Peter, Paul, and Mary and Dylan and the Beatles and Joan Baez. And my parents were big band freaks, and so I'd have to sneak off of my little leather-covered radio under this pillow and listen to WWVA, West Virginia, and listen to the barn dance because I wanted to hear country and stuff like that.
Yeah.
And I kind of endured a couple years at TCU or at Ohio State trying to be a khaki pants yuppie guy, and that,
It just wasn't you?
fell apart. Huh?
It wasn't you?
No, it wasn't me. And so I looked around at colleges and was trying to think of going somewhere else. And because of my grade average, which was a C+, and that's only because I either got D's or failed and got A pluses, and nobody's figured that one out, that I didn't like to do that.
Yeah. Yeah.
I ended up at TCU in Fort Worth because they had a rodeo program. It was a Christian school, and they had no out-of-state college fees, and it was expensive, but they would take me as a C+ student. And so I headed down to TCU to rodeo. I was going to be a bronc rider, bareback bronc rider, because I'm a little too big for saddle bronc and actually almost too big for that. And they had an art school and kind of got in there and met my wife in '66. And I migrated because of the programs that they had in art. I ended up getting into sculpture because there was no particular pencil drawing or anything like that. I didn't like lettering, and I just fell into. I thought the sculpture thing seemed to fit me better, and I started casting bronze. I couldn't afford it, but I would cast aluminum and helping the teacher. And at some point, and welding, we're so broke back then that we used old gas tanks and anything I could make sculpture out of, and brazed it together using coat hangers for bracing rod.
Oh, for
because we didn't have any money.
Wow.
And that was a trick. That was an interesting maneuver, but we pulled it off. And cast a lot of aluminum and bronze with a guy named Harry Geffert. At some point, I was the only undergraduate with keys to the sculpture lab where I could go in and work at night. Harry and I got along really well, and he got me hyped up to do that. And in the midst of trying to chase my wife around, I decided at some point I'm working the oil fields in the summer, and we had kind of split up, and I knew she had family in California, so I just decided I would go to Berkeley. I had read about that in my other searches for college and was kind of intrigued. I remember somehow I read one of their brochures, and it stuck in my head. This was like years later. I'm going, huh. And I knew at that time that Peter Vokas was out there on the West Coast. He was not doing pottery. He was doing pretty much what I was doing. He's casting bronze and doing that stuff and hanging out on the docks in San Francisco with the stevedores and Mr. Macho. And so I headed west to find Peter Vokas and my wife. I didn't catch either one of them at that time.
Now, for clarity, you were looking at Berkeley. Did you attempt to get in there at all, or
I did. Okay. I tried a couple of times, and I hit out there, and I had been working in the oil fields prior to that here in Texas to make money in the summer times, and working on drilling rigs. And so when I got out there, I thought, well, I'd do that. Well, they were too far away, and they were building the BART subway tunnel at that time.
Sure.
And so here I am. I'm out there. She's not there. She's in Washington State, and there I am in Berkeley in 1967. I missed the summer of love, but the fall wasn't too bad.
I got to tell you, you were talking about this, and I was thinking back at that time, and I actually did get accepted into Berkeley right about that time. I mean, I was still in high school, but I was going to go there and be an architect. I'd already been, accepted and all that sort of thing. And then this quick little interjection here, I ended up deciding not to do that because I thought it was going to be too hard. And I really wanted to go into radio and TV because that was what my dad was doing. My dad was in radio. And so I bailed on that and ended up coming down here to UCI. But had that gone ahead, we might have seen each other. Had that all of those things happen. It was right about the same time.
Yeah. When I got out there, I needed a job. It didn't take me very long to find out that in asking around that laborers were being hired on BART, the Bay Area Rapid Transit, and I needed money. It took me a case of oil to get my old Chevy car from Midland, Texas to San Francisco.
Wow, that's changing it every 50 miles or something.
I seem like every time you put gas in, you put oil in it. And Dad helped me rebuild the engine out there because the cops didn't like the fact that it smoked a lot. I was politely warned. And then I was working with Bart while I was making a ton of money. And started hanging out in Berkeley on the days off or whenever we did have off. And, back then, I guess working that kind of a job at age 23, I was the youngest labor foreman ever to work for Perini, Brown and Root, who was one of the major contractors of the BART system, and did that until it petered out. I mean, in those days, we were making $70 a day in free air, and when the air pressure went on, we got to $100 a day. And when the air pressure went to 36 pounds, when we were working under the bay of San Francisco, coming out from San Francisco, under the water.
Really?
We worked 3 hours and we decompressed 3 hours and 10 minutes. So we probably worked 2.5 hours max, and then went and sat in the decompression chamber and still made $100.
Gee.
That was a lot of money for a hippie boy. I bought a house, bought guitars, and started hanging out I started messing with guitars. I'd been doing that since Ohio State, and I would buy these Harmony. The ones I liked were the all mahogany Harmonies, kind of like a LGO or a Martin 015 or something. And when I hit out there, I was piddling with them a little. I didn't know much, but I'd learned finger picking from a roommate and really got away from the folk into old-timey and stuff. And so people were, doing a little bit of guitar work on. I had a little bench and something, and I bought a 1946 Herringbone D28 for $500.
Wow, that was a big investment in those days, probably, huh?
Yes, and it was refinished and didn't have a truss rod. It was one of those war years things. There was no truss rod, light as a feather. But it had been refinished, and I, like a goofball, decided that I would put new gears on it. Gold shallers. Right. You can see this coming, can't you? And so I've got those, and I've got my drill bit with a piece of tape on it. I'm drilling through the back to open that hole up a little bit and drill one in there, and it fits perfect. And I drill another one, and then about the third one, the drill bit just caught and ran through the peg head. Whoomp! Whoa! And I turned it over, and it looked fine. And I put the gear in there and put the washer, and the big washer covered that up. That whole hole went all the way through, but it covered it up. And I went, fine. And I turned it over and drilled the other three just like that. Bam, bam, bam. Chipped every one of them. All the veneer.
Oh, man.
So I ask around. I take it to Lundberg's, who I would later work for and become great friends with, John Lundberg, out of Chicago. And they want $35 to put a new veneer on the peg head and a decal and to put a finish on it. I just was like, $35? So consequently, I did it myself. And by this time, I had run into a guy named Campbell Coe, a legend in the Bay Area of music and repairs and stuff. And he helped me a little with some stuff, and I started hanging out with. I got that fixed, and then I was working for a girl and her guitar buzz, and then Larry Jameson fixed it, and I went to see him to see who my competition was. And as the story goes, I've told it many times, he got the girl, I got a job. But
I think I've heard that before.
Yeah. And so I finally the subway system peeled out, and they all went to Detroit, and I stayed. And Larry had a little shop in Oakland, and I was playing bass with some different bands, with Blackie Farrell in one band, and Steve Young, who wrote Seven Bridges Road, in another band. And I was kind of this budding young country bass player. I wasn't Jocko. But Larry decided he was going to buy this building, or get this building at Rosengrove, and I decided I was a better repairman than a bass player, and that's when Guitar Resurrection was born in Berkeley. And we were like one of the few perfect teams in my life. I had all the wood shop experience, and I could build a rocking chair, but he knew what made a guitar a guitar.
Got it.
And he did everything by hand, and pretty soon I'm taking routers and doing, wait, let's do this. Done. Better than you can do it by hand, and quicker. So we ended up with Guitar Resurrection as one of the premier, and back then there weren't many shops that were repairmen and dealing with vintage, because we would drive all over the country in the late 60s and early 70s, and you couldn't find a guitar repairman hardly anywhere. There'd be old fiddle maker or fiddle repairman who hated working on guitars, but he needed the money.
Got it. Yeah.
So even when before Gruen started his shop, he came to visit us, and Stu Goldberg from Marina Music brought him over, and he looked at our operation, and, we were already selling stuff overseas, even though we were maxed out 250, 275 with a Maple Neck Strat. We were still driving back east to pawn shops and army bases and buying them for a little over 100. But
and then, so this was were you guys in business together, or what?
Yes. First I worked for him, and then at some point the shop got going, and another guy, Jim Lehman, who now still has Guitar Rest in Austin, had been in business with another guy, Dan Alexander, and they had a little store, and that fell apart. And so Jim came and put his guitars in our shop. I say our shop in Guitar Rest, and he worked the desk for no percentage. And then when they decided to really roll it up, I didn't have enough money. I had some guitars that I had bought, but I didn't have enough money to throw my guitars in everything. So they created Guitar Resurrection as two guys, and I got the Resurrection. So I got the repair business, and we stayed doing that for years. At some point, I had 5 or 6 guys working for me, including Fat Dog from Subway Guitars. Fatty worked for me and numerous other guys, and in those days, the New York guys were in and out of town all the time, and we knew Matt Humanoff and everybody, and all the, and plus we were surrounded in those days by all the old guys. The Aschow brothers had an acoustic. They were violin makers, but they built guitars and arch tops. And, of course, Lundberg's Music, and Hideo Kamamoto had his shop down in Oakland, who wrote the first repair book, Complete Guitar Repair by Hideo Kamamoto. He was a friend of ours, and he would give us manuscripts periodically, give them to Larry and I. We'd read them just for, I don't know that we ever changed anything or even found a spelling error, but he was polite enough he was a good guy. Hideo I still talk to him once in a while, and Campbell Coe, of course, and then Lundberg's main repairman back then was Mario Martello, an old guy who was really good. I never met Rick Turner back then, but we all knew about Alembic, and we would see their stuff. And another old store which wasn't great in San Francisco was Satterley and Chapin, and of course Prune Music back then was, and I think Larry Craig was their repairman. My memory is not quite sure, but that was Randall Smith of Randall Lamps, and we always just called him Randy Prune, and. There was another little place that Larry had. His first shop was over in the second floor above a place called Magic Music Machines, and I cannot remember Dale's last name, but he was a amp hot rodder back then, and we were only, down the street from Leo's Music, which later moved up to college in Berkeley, and was, originally was one of those big old music stores with all these funny old guys at the counter and all that, kind of a normal, but they kind of got into the vintage thing early. And I'm trying to remember the main salesman I hung out with. His name is Bill. I'm still hooked up to him, and I'm blank. But there was a lot going on, and we were surrounded, and we're in that, and all the New York guys were in and out of there. Matt Humanoff and Mark Silber eventually came out and opened a store, and it was just a big conglomeration of guys, and nobody hid anything. We all just sat around and talked and hung out with each other and went, wow, that's neat, you did that. And that was the good old days from, me growing up in Ohio up through kind of Berkeley.
Now, where does that take us up? Where does that take us up to in the next
time-wise?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, probably about when I left there, right about 1974,
Okay.
I never got to deal with Peter Vokas or do any of that. I never got into University of California. I either didn't have the money or the time, or I was stoned, or the band had a gig, all of the above. I didn't care. At some point, I just life took over, and Guitar Res came to Austin about 1973. A lady, Velma Shelton, was going to Scripps College out there, and she had been a student of my wife's, who wasn't my wife then yet, who she taught art at TCU in Fort Worth. And she came over to visit Alice when she was there visiting me, and met Larry, and they kind of fell in love and were a unit for many years. Velma's aunt was a lady who started the Kimball. Her name was Mrs. Kimball, and she started the Kimball Art Museum in Fort Worth, Texas. Have you ever read about that? Or Google it up and look at it. But so at some point, Larry in 73 decided to move to Austin. Velma wanted to come back to Texas, and so they moved down here. I stuck around about another year because at that time I had my shop in my house, and I was still dealing with Jesse Colin Young and Country Joe, and a lot of my hardcore customers that stuck with me there. And Bobby Weir, I did a lot of stuff for him, and Nils Lofgren would come up from L.A. So I kept those, and I stuck around for about a year until 74, and decided I needed to go back to Texas and chase Alice harder, and that's what I did. I just packed everything up, and somehow she had gotten me an interview, and I got this job on a horse training ranch in Weatherford, Texas, where she was working as a housekeeper and a bookkeeper, and doing her jewelry, and it had a back room and all that. And, no sooner had I taken the job and moved to Weatherford, work for this horse trainer, than she moved to Fort Worth. Yeah. So it took me 20 years to capture her, but after that we were married for 30. It was great. But
awesome.
So that got me back into Texas in 74. I know I made the 75 Arabian Horse Nationals because that's what I was doing. And people knew I was in Texas. Different guys in the guitar business like Jimmy Wallace and Mark and other people. But I didn't do anything until about, I think, 79. The horse business fell apart because of the oil business. And I moved to Austin, which it was a prime time to move to Austin. And because of Stevie and Jimmy and the whole Austin scene, and the customers just kind of fell in my lap when I moved down there. And
what did you do? What did you set up there? Did you set up a shop of your own?
I had to set up a shop of my own. Larry had started Guitar Resurrection. He moved it down there right next to Dan Erlewine's cousin, Mark.
Right.
And in moving his guitar shop there, he had to sign an agreement with Mark not to do public repairs. You did non-competition. He could work on anything he bought to resell, and so I couldn't work out of that store, but Larry was my mouthpiece, sending me. And so I moved down there and set up a shop out on Lake Austin Estates, and he sent me lots of business.
And was it mostly repair business?
Yes, still repairs at this point. I had not built anything particularly, and I was, I had Stevie and Jimmy and Eric Johnson and David Grissom and Omar and the Howlers, and I hooked up with Clifford Antone. Do you know anything about that club?
No, I don't think so.
Antone's Blues Club. You do Google a little bit, but Clifford Antone had a club there. Basically, Clifford was into blues. And that's where I hooked up with Buddy Guy, and we got to be buddies. And through that scene, I got the job to build a V for Albert King, which by the time I gave it to Clifford, who paid for it, he and Albert were on the outs, and then Albert died. And then it's a long story. But I got to hang out with all the cool blues guys he would bring in there. Just unbelievable. Albert Collins and just Jimmy Rogers. We're not talking about Jimmy Rogers. We're talking about the blues guy. And Matt Murphy, and just working for all these cool Luther Tucker and just all kinds of guys. Clifford would bring them to the shop. It was like celebrity day, once or two times a week. It seemed like. So
it sounds like you developed a bit of a reputation at that point. You had work coming toward you. Is that right?
Right. Yeah, and shortly after getting down there, the Dallas Guitar Show had had his first show in 1978. And it was Charlie Wears and Danny Thorpe and blank on the third guy, who later went on and went to the Three Amigos, but my brain's dead. And I missed the first show. So on the second show, 79, Larry tells me about it, and he says, you should go. And it's a vintage guitar show. I said, well, I don't have any vintage guitars. He said, well, do something, take it up there. So he gives me a ragged out double cutaway Junior. It says, do something with this. So I tear it apart and put a carved maple top on it.
Oh, boy.
And yeah, bind the fingerboard. I think I left it dots, as far as I remember, and it's left a Junior logo on it, or put one on it. I'm sure we've plenty of them fake around. And that was what I showed in faded red. And so in 1979, I beat Paul Reed Smith a few years.
Wow.
Although Paul and I are good friends, and maybe he got the idea there. Maybe he never saw it. I don't know. So I go to the 79 show. There's 13 booths. 13.
13, wow.
And one of them's me. And I figure that
you had one.
The only reason they let me in is if they told me I couldn't come, I wouldn't fix their guitars.
You had one guitar to show?
Yeah, one guitar for show, and I took orders for repairs.
Okay.
So I went, after I think that first show, I went home with $3,500 worth of repairs.
Wow.
Booked to
That's not
work
bad
on.
in those days. Not bad.
Nope. And I did that for a few years, but I wasn't showing any vintage. The vintage that I would show would be my collection of cowboy guitars or my hula guitars by Regal, my Roy Smeck harmonies with the chrome trim on them, and I always took the weird stuff. And so at some point, Larry Briggs gave me the credit for starting that scene of collecting these old, funny, weird guitars, because everybody else had Strats and Les Pauls and Flying V's and Explorers, and I'm there with Regal Harmony cowboy guitars and Hawaiian painted guitars and just weird stuff, and I get credit for starting that trend of collecting the oddballs.
Were you selling?
So I did that for a bunch of. I did that right up till when I went to Fender. I was always at those shows. I got a plaque somewhere. It says how many years I was there. John Brinkman was the third guy, and in all those Dallas guitar shows, I'd meet all the New York guys, Matt Humanoff and John Peden, and all the dealers and all the guys coming in from the East Coast, and then after I did that double neck for Christopher Cross about 81, I run into Yasuhiko Iwanati. At then he was just a writer and a repairman in Japan, and he's got a bag full of Fender 12-string parts, and he stops by my booth and he looks at the picture of Chris Cross's guitar and he says, I want one, and he just handed me this bag which only had the neck and the parts and the pick guards and stuff, and that started my relationship with him and Japan. And prior to going to Fender, I probably had from 81 on a half a dozen at least articles in Japanese guitar magazines, Player being one of them, which was Ritor Music Corporation. Mm-hmm. And that first one was like 2 pages of color, 2 pages in black and white.
So that must have catapulted you a little bit, huh?
It did. I was starting to get all these things in Japanese magazines, and I was building custom stuff. And in that era, I built a mandolin for Paul Glass, and then was working on Roscoe Beck's 6-string bass that he later with Robin Ford cut Talk to Your Daughter, which was a great solo. And then Junior Brown came along. All of that, in that era up to about 85. And that's what caught the attention of the world. I was just in the right damn place. I was working for Stevie and Jimmy and everybody, although I never built them anything. I bet I worked on number one for Stevie as many times as Renee did. We both worked on that guitar. Renee didn't do as much cosmetic and wood restoration as I did. He was, a great road guy and great fret guy. And, Renee he was good.
Well, I want to move.
Kick in.
Yeah, well, I've been thinking about this, and you've probably been asked some variation of this question a million times before, but I kind of wanted to know, and you've led up to it a little bit, about what was going on with your business, at the time leading up to your move over to Fender and the launch of the Custom Shop. But I also want to know what that decision-making process was like for you. What did you go through to ultimately make that decision and make the move?
Well, I don't think it was too tricky, but, I had all this going on. Things are going pretty good, but I'm still not making a lot of money. And by the time that Fender called, which would have been early 86, I think. You know, at that point, Alice and I got back to about 85, and she was coming in from Alpine out here into Austin and hanging out with me, and we decided we're getting married. We finally figured that. I'd finally chased her for 20 years, and she said yes. And so, just out of the blue, I get a call from Dan Smith at Fender. And Dan was really close with Robin Ford. And so Dan had seen the 6-string basses I did for Roscoe. Maybe earlier that year at the NAMM show, I'm thinking Roscoe brought him by. It's kind of a vague memory because I started doing NAMM shows with Seymour Duncan with my guitars using his pickups. And I guess the earliest one I did was 82. And Paul Reed Smith and I were both in the same booth with Seymour Duncan. And he had the prototype Santana, the one that Santana played.
Sure.
And I had a classic and I had a mandolin there. But and I was doing that. And so I think with the Fender thing, I was working with a German pickup company. I was there. But so Dan calls me and says, okay, Fender's thinking about, we want to get into the multi-string bass business. We want to, and we're wondering if you would consult with us because Fender's history with multi-string basses was pretty weak. The 5-string bass that they tried in the 60s was horrible looking and functional, and the 6-string bass was a guitar. It was made for guitar players.
Yeah, I remember that.
Yeah. It was, you had to play it with a flat pick, and Cassidy had one. The only cool thing that Cassidy did with it back then, and it was painted like the SG and the Hendrix guitar, it was all psychedelic, was he took the middle pickup and somebody, I think it was the middle pick, I'm almost positive, and they tipped it at the reverse angle of a telly, like I do with a lot of my guitars, to get that tighter bass, leave the treble where it is, it's fine, just move it back so you don't get so much mush. And he had done that, I noticed. So Fender didn't have much going on in that, and they had seen, Ken Smith was doing multi-string basses, and so I said, well, yeah, I'm interested. Let's kick this around. And, I'm still working and doing stuff, and later Dan calls back and says, we're thinking maybe we'd like to go ahead with that, but maybe we'll just license your bass and go from there. And so I'm, at this point I'm going, well, that's not a bad idea. I'm getting married and maybe we can, and always struggling to make money like a typical artist. And the third phone call, he comes back and he says, look, we're contemplating doing a custom shop and we might just roll all this together. You want to throw your name in the ring? And I said, send me some details. Yes, let's talk. And they send me, shortly after that, they send me what they're thinking and salary-wise and blah, 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 what it consists of. And all of that had come up around because at that time, Page had decided to bail out of R&D at some point in there. Prior to that, a little, I guess.
And he went off and did his own thing for a while. I mean, we interviewed him a few episodes ago and told us about that. So he was. Yeah,
he wanted to be a rock singer. So Page left. Yeah. That left the opening in R&D, and they had already hired George Blanda Jr., and his dad was a quarterback, who had been hanging around wanting a job, kind of like Page, just hungry. He really wanted to work there. But George is an engineer, and they sort of hired him thinking that maybe George would do custom shop. They're kind of kicking it all around. Nothing's solid. And George builds pretty much Gibson-style guitars. He's a good builder, and what I saw was pretty much like my Specials and Juniors and Carve Tops. And so, but he takes the R&D job so he can be an engineer and do what he likes to do with engineers. And did well. George is still there. I love George to death. He's a great guy. So then Page is gone, and who would have probably, if he had stayed, he would have got the job of running the custom shop, I would think. But in retrospect, I think it was better that he didn't. But so then it got down to, I sent them all my stuff, and at some point they called me back and said, well, it's down to 2 guys, and we want to interview you. And the second guy was Stephen Davies up in Seattle. And when I looked at his portfolio, I went, wow, this guy's hot. He didn't have the PR, and that's what I had, was the PR just by being in the right place, I guess, the right time and doing things right. I had all this background.
Sure, you'd been working at
magazines and all this stuff, because Stephen was a really good builder, and he did great. And I met him later at some point after I was at Fender, went up there because Alice's parents were up there, and went to Seattle and met him. He's a great guy. I haven't talked to him for a long time. I don't know if you remember, there was a guitar that the Japanese, one of the companies, took over called the Stevens Extended Cutaway.
Yeah, no, I don't.
Yeah, it was a bolt-on neck, but if you unbolted the neck, like a Fender neck, it had a chunk of wood on it. Made it look like a battle axe.
Oh.
It was a semi-curved thing, and so when you played up the neck, you cut into this. Your hand went into this thing. There was nothing in your way. The plate wasn't there. It was pretty interesting, and it lasted for a while. And it had the ability to slightly rotate to line the strings up on the fingerboard really perfectly. It was pretty interesting, and one of those companies picked it up, and I haven't talked to Stephen for a long time, but at some point they say, we want you to come out here and talk. And in the interim of that, I get a call from Gibson Guitars, and I think it was 85 or 86. I can't remember. I'd have to go look whenever my dad died. But I sent a Flying V and my assistant to the Dallas Guitar Show. Well, my custom-made Flying V goes to a vintage guitar show in Dallas and wins Best of Show.
Wow.
Figure that one out.
Yeah, really.
And it has no logo on the peghead. Didn't want to put Gibson on it. Not me. But other than that, it's like drop dead perfect. And instead of suing me, some Gibson rep saw it. They tell Henry, they call me, and in the same time frame, and I'm talking to Dan Smith, Gibson is calling me about a custom shop job. I don't know what. They don't elaborate. They're just interested. And, so I have to go out and buy a bigger hat, and all that kind of stuff. So
did you talk to them?
Yes, I did. I set it up at some point to go to California to talk to Fender. And I'm really wanting to do that. I mean, I want to hang 10. I'm going to be the surfer dude and go out there. And so in the negotiation for that, I said, well, I'm bringing my fiance. I'm going to marry this woman, and she gets to decide. I pretty well made up my mind I was going to go there, but I want her to come to the meetings. And of course, these corporate guys go, this is highly unusual, Mr. Siebel.
I would think so. I would think they would think that.
Yes, they did. And I said, look, guys, when I walk out of the room, you're going to all sit around and talk about me. I would like to have somebody that I could talk to about you. And they had
that's a good strategy. That's a great strategy.
After that, and they said, she's not going to talk during a meeting. I said, she's just going to sit there and watch you and talk to me later. She's really good at analyzing things. And they bought it. And so flew us both out there and stuck us in a condo with Don Johnson, who was the head of sales reps. Really cool guy. Really liked him a lot. I really like most of the guys out there, and talk to them and about the whole thing. And then we get on a plane, we come back, and I dump Alice in El Paso. I go to Austin, and I think by the time I got to Austin and slept the night, put new shirts in my traveling bag, my old horse show leather bag, which carries a pair of boots also. I'm in the next evening. She gets back to Alpine took her 8 hours to get from El Paso to here on the bus.
Oh boy. Wow.
The next evening, I'm in the green room of the original Grand Ole Opry talking to Bill Monroe with Charlie, who works for Gibson, who restored his mandolin when his wife beat it all up. And I spent 3 or 4 days there, and I liked what they were doing. Most of my stuff, if you looked at it then, was kind of Gibson oriented. Could go on either way. I hung out with Ward, who used to run the Kalamazoo Epiphone facility. Great guy, loved my stuff. Tim Shaw was running the Gibson Custom Shop then, and I stayed about 3 or 4 days, but the deal was different. It was less offered to me than Fender, and I couldn't work on my own stuff or do repairs in my garage. And at the end of the thing, I go to Tim Shaw's office, and he says, because I had told him I'm interviewing with somebody else, but I'm interested. I want to talk to everybody. And he said, Fender? And I said, yes. And he said, what did they offer you? And I said, your job. And he said, I thought so. Tim works for Fender now.
Oh, okay.
I saw him at the NAMM show in 2017, was out there. He did the guild part been around. And I met Tim when he had an instrument repair shop in wherever Gibson was, the Kalamazoo. Mm-hmm. He had a repair shop there when I was traveling around buying vintage guitars. I ran into him up there with his partner. And that was late 70s, I guess, early 80s maybe. So
you went ahead and you took the job? You took the job at
Yeah.
Fender. Obviously,
so
we know
took
that.
The job with Fender.
We know that.
And
you moved
they
out
said,
there.
okay,
right?
and that would have been December of '86, and they were trying to get Eric Johnson ready for the trade show. They'd signed him, but he was my customer, and so they sent me a bunch of boxes, and there were necks, and because they wanted him to endorse American Standard Strats. So they sent me some bunch of bodies and pick guards and pickups and necks and stuff, and Eric and I, put a bunch of stuff together quickly and listened to them and switched things around, and finally came up with 2 guitars we liked. And so once we decided we liked those, I tricked those out, refretted them, and got them ready for him to where they played like his vintage guitars, like Virginia, and for the trade show. So we were ready. Sometime in January, I blast out there, and Alice goes looking for us a place to live. Immediately, I start working on Clapton guitars, because I got Eric done. I got Eric Jr. Johnson. I'm working on Eric Clapton. And we start working on the Clapton models because they'd been messing with that for a bunch of years. And so I start working on necks to make that happen for the trade show. And Alice finds a house, and I come back, and we pack up and move. And I never saw the house till I got in it in, almost February, but, or just a little after February, because the trade show's at the end of January. And we start working. And Paige and I, and in that interview kind of thing, they wanted me to pick a assistant, and they said, you can bring anybody you want. We'd like you to look at these guys. And Dan had at least one guy from Yamaha, I think. But I talked to Paige first and hit it off with John really well. And, I realized that I needed John, that I'm a bumpkin, and this guy's been with Fender this long. He knows how this group works, and I don't. I don't know anything. And we really hit it off great. And at some point in the interim of doing that, Alice says to me, and she's real astute. She was a counselor for runaway kids and all kinds of stuff in the system here in Texas, and she's counseled a lot. She says, he wants your job.
Paige wants your job? Well, he said, Paige wants your job?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Well, you think he quits to go to be rock and roll. All this happens. He comes back, and I got a job that he could have, right? And she says, he wants your job. And I said, well, yeah, I know that. I mean, if he didn't, he'd be stupid. So we worked it out. Paige taught me all about, because he knew I never had a pair of digital calipers, so I got there. And he taught me that and how to interact with Gary York, the machinist, and he taught me how the corporation works. And what he didn't have was what I had from the vintage business, of the minutia of guitars. Because whatever they did from back then in R&D, and I'm sure the guitar all got tweaked in the outer world, and the knowledge of vintage. Paige had the knowledge from the time he started working there till the time we were, and I knew all about Fender from the first broadcaster. He'd heard those things, but he didn't know. And it's like when we hired Fred. Fred knew his tellies better than I did, because Fred was a telly nut. And so when we started picking up guys, and Fred was a tuner tester out on the line, we find Fred, and he's like this Telecaster crazy guy. But, Paige knew what he knew, I knew what I knew, and we traded. And we just went, what one guy knew, the other guy didn't know. We all just went.
So it was a real synergistic relationship that delivered a lot of results, right?
It did. And when at some point when we realized that 2 guys can't build that many guitars, and I don't know if it was when we suddenly realized it was 300 or 600 orders, didn't make any difference. Could have been 287. 2 guys can't do this.
Yeah, I would think you build 10, 12, 15 guitars a year on your own.
Right. And we had all this background and all this, but they hadn't built us a shop. We were working out of my garage. You've heard the old stories about the infamous garage, because there was no tooling. We had this theoretical space. Oh, great, I can make a nut in here, right? But and it took a while for them to tool us up and get us in there and get something going on. And we started picking up guys and hiring. We knew we needed more people, even though we were still trying to build basically one-offs. And, marketing was trying to run it through a slot. They wanted, okay, we do 57 reissues, and we do 52 reissue tellies, and we do 62 reissue strats. And they tried to make it work in that. And, I'm going, that's not working. Japanese call me up and they wanted a Dakota red telly with a rosewood fingerboard. They don't want slotted head screws, right? They don't want a single thickness black Bakelite pickguard on that. They want a multi-lam. They want a 60s telly. And it took a while for me to beat on marketing that, okay, that's, you can't do the cookie cutter. Forget that. And, there was interesting little things, but they built us a shop and turned us loose. And we started buying some of our own wood. And in the early days, Paige and I when the semis would come in, we'd get up and on top of the truck and unload the ash. And
we're doing everything
on each end of the semi, and we pick up a board and go, "Ooh, I like that one. That's ours." And we put it off on the other. We're cherry picking the lumber because it was coming in rough then. They hadn't palleted everything, and we had no wood stash, and we were figuring out how to function in the capacity. Paige is really a quick learner, and he started picking that up really quick. I'm an aesthetic nut, and when Schultz he looked at me, he said, "I want the coolest custom shop on the planet, and if we break even, I'll be happy." And I said, "Sir, I can do that." Because I'd been in the repair business long enough to know that I always had trouble making money. But in a situation like this, if break even is it, well, it didn't take them long to figure out that there was a way to make money.
And
I could make them the coolest shop. And so that's when I brought it. I had, all these guitars stored. And when they finally gave us a really nice place to set up, I started hanging the guitars on the wall, and I would find these batches of plexiglass templates they were all from CBS when they made templates out of plexiglass and used Dykem, and they'd spray it on there and scrape the things. And all those stacked, and for years, the Dykem turned different colors of lavender, blue, and they were art, even though I didn't want to build that guitar. So I hung those on the walls and had hula guitars and cowboy guitars, and the executives didn't get it. Dan Smith got it, but nobody else did.
Yeah.
Every guitar player that walked in there went, "Oh, these guys are guitar guys."
Yeah, it wasn't the stuffy corporate stuff.
And that's the other thing, is that I had such a vintage following that immediately on getting hired, the vintage world went, "What? You're kidding." And they started paying attention. That was kind of my contribution, was to the aesthetics and doing that. And every guy we hired, I made him pick a color. We got them out there. You want Daphne blue? Paint all your tool handles Daphne blue.
Oh, that's interesting.
And I painted all mine red. And there were some tools that we couldn't afford a lot of them. And I would have one, and I'd end up showing up late in the day because I'd been there all night. And somebody would run up and say, "I've got your tool. I'm putting it back now." And everybody had their own workspace, and their tool handles and everything were color-coded to them. And we had guitar pictures, and Billy Gibbons would come to see me and sign autographs for everybody in the shop, and then blast off when we were building him and Dusty a couple of guitars, and just got their attention that we are doing something. I think I'd put it in Wheeler's book at some point, that we at some point realized that we were it. We were making a difference.
And
production started calling us. They have problems, they call us. And once we got the second shop really going, the first shop was a little rough, getting the climate control and all that, because they hadn't figured it out. But the second version, we had this really nice shop, and Santa Ana winds came in one time and knocked out their neck production because the factory was kind of open, and the skunk stripes dried up and fell out. Well, that was a major problem.
Wow.
Big meeting. And big trauma. And Schultz looks at me and Paige, he says, "Okay, Stevens, what'd you guys lose?" And I said, "Nothing, sir." He said, "Nothing?" I said, "No. You gave me the climate-controlled shop I wanted. It doesn't care what's going on outside." He went, "Oh." I mean, the next day, because it was a factory kind of thing where you could drive a semi loaded to max height through the whole thing. All those doors were covered up with plastic, and in no time, that whole factory was climate controlled, and they were watching the hygrometers and stuff, because we didn't lose anything. We just, we're fine.
Great.
And then there was, so much stuff scattered around, templates, And there were not many blueprints because I went to, in the early days when I had nothing else to do, I'd go to Brea to the offices and go through the blueprint drawers. And they had no blueprints prior to 65, and that was all CBS. But I copied bunches of them anyway. It's, Freddie and Tavares and Leo made the Strat on a piece of butcher paper, cut the body out, cut it out of steel, and that piece of paper died. But when we made the first James Jamerson reissue bass off of the original templates from 1965, I found all that stuff. It would be just laying everywhere in corners. At some point, I had a stack of steel body templates, which they used on the pin router, as tall as Page in a closet. Yeah, and when I didn't want a Broncos or some of those or Katanas or something, but every time I'd find them, nobody cared. They're in the dust. I'd take them in the custom shop, and we had all that stuff to decide what to do with. In those days, it was fun, and that was I guess that's what I contributed. The kickstart, I'd come from a lucky part of the world, and if Page had got it in the very beginning, he was a quick learner. I would have just taken longer, but I think the fact that we worked together, he and I both learned stuff, and when it got to be there was needed a manager, and I was talking to them about that, and I said, I don't want to do that. Page can, and they said, okay, we're going to let him do this, and I went, fine. But I'm a rambler, so I don't know what you can. Well, conclude out of that.
I remember ramblers, in those days. But let me do this. Let's, you were only, it seems to me, in the whole scheme of things, you were only at the custom shop a few years. I'm right, 4 years.
Exactly.
You ended up taking off and moving back to Texas. Do I have that right, or was there something in between?
Right. No, that was one of the agreements with my wife. She said, you can get rich and famous in 5 years. I'm going home and buy land and drill a well. You can stay out here if you want to. But we lasted 4 and actually, because I left in November, from December, of 86 through, it was exactly 4 years.
Yeah.
But I pulled off a lot of firsts, with the custom shop, and then the LJ with a set neck, with a carved top, with my name on the peg head.
It's a legacy. You have a legacy there, and I think you're certainly considered one of the top guys. I always have considered you.
And I still get along. It was nice doing when we did the 30th anniversary in 2017 at the last NAMM.
That was
was really fun.
That was nice. I saw a lot of those. They did some nice videos, and there was a lot of good stuff there. So I want to move along. We have a little bit of time left. And
only a little bit? My God, I can talk for hours.
We're already going to set the record with you, my friend, but it's worth every moment of it. But, so you're back in the Texas desert, as I guess I would say it, being out here in California. You've been making just incredible guitars for probably more than a couple decades now. I'll just generalize it. It's some amount of time like that. And I'm just kind of wondering if you can give us a sense of what it's like to run a business out in what most people would consider the middle of nowhere. What's that like? Benefits versus challenges?
Well, the benefits to me is, nobody around here. I'm not doing so much anymore, but I could build guitars and then go be a cowboy on a weekend. The challenges at first when I came out here was the fact that there's only one hardware store and then a lumber store, but they're not dealing with what I'm dealing with. I got over that, a frustration of not being able to just go somewhere and get some normal stuff. You had to order it and keep ahead of that. And, being out here, there's not any backup in help. Anybody that wants to work for you, which I've only done that a couple times, they have to move a long way, and they move to a place where housing is hard, and they don't know if you have to be happy with yourself out here or it doesn't work out. We've seen a lot of people move out here that are married, and a year or two later they're not married because they had to talk to each other.
Yeah.
Well, now we got internet and things are different, but I got over the fact that I couldn't get things quick. You just order ahead, and and I knew a lot of people, so that wasn't a big deal. It was never particularly a problem to me in that sense.
But you've got it
out here
for you. It's
go ahead
for you. Well, for you, it works. If you think about it, you've been running your business out there for a lot of years now, and you have just had a tremendous amount of of success in a lot of ways, but you wouldn't still be there and be doing it if it wasn't working and if you weren't reasonably happy with it. So I guess we could draw the conclusion that you've adapted and that whatever challenges we might think would exist by being in that environment, you've overcome and you've made it work, and you made it work well enough to create, tremendous instruments and develop a reputation over many years that's right up there at the top.
Well, that's part of what made it work. I think a young guy coming out here who's a nobody would really have a much harder job. He would have to spend more time at trade shows and guitar shows and stuff and getting his name out there because you're stuck. Whereas when I moved out here, I was already pretty confident, and people were following me around. And
well, and you're right. You had a name, and that has continued. We certainly can see it. Are you still operating on the same schedule or frequency that you have over the years, or has anything changed in recent years?
Well, the thing that changed with me was my wife dying, getting sick. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And that took 2 years out of my life because we kept her here at the house, and I'm shipping orders now that most people would be irate about 4 years or 4 years plus of customers who said, it's just a guitar. Go do it. Call me when you're ready. Other people that if their guitar had taken that long would, they'd be on all the blogs and all that kind of stuff. So I lucked out there, and that's slow. And now I'm back to catching up, and I'm close to getting back to a point where I could take new orders. And I have a list of guys who want stuff. I don't know how many will last. Yeah. Out of that,
what kind of lead time are you working with now?
Well,
a couple years.
I'm just trying to get
a couple of years.
Oh, I'm trying to get things out now in a year or less. Mm-hmm. But they're orders that are 4 years old.
Right.
And so they've been waiting for me to get caught up. And now that part of my life I'm fairly healed up on, but I think it'll take me the rest of this year to get close. And then I start calling guys about, the names that I've got. And I've got guys all over the world who are kind of hanging out to see what I'll say when I tell them. Prior to that, it was pretty much I was running about a couple of years. I had enough orders, and I don't have any CNC. I hired some CNC stuff done from Tom Ellis in Austin. Little parts things. But as far as the woodworking, I pull down a plank and start whittling away with my bandsaw here. A lot of these younger guys, they all grew up with CNCs and computers and all that stuff, and it's not something that I do. I don't even have a smartphone. But so I sub a few things out to Ellis, and the old machinist Gary York from Fender still does some stuff for me periodically every couple of years. And I'm hooked up to my parts guys, and pretty set for wood right now. I'm always looking for some stuff, little pieces and exotic. I've got plenty of fingerboards. Rosewood and maple's not a big deal. So I'm set there. I think by the end of this year, I should be pretty well to the point where I can call some of these guys and say, okay, I'm back on, and I can give them 18 months to 2, depending on the complexity of the guitar. And, there's a bunch of things I'm trying to get done in my shop that didn't happen. I have the original duplicator from Fender that we built the Claptons and the Yngwies and Stu Hamm basses on. It's a neck carver, kind of like their old Zuckerman that I bought. And I want to get it running. And I'm rebuilding a bandsaw and just some tools that I've got that sort of fell by the wayside that I have to walk around them. So I want them running before I can't do anything, because I'm 73, so who knows. I'd like to work another 10, 12, 15 years.
Well, I don't think there's any reason to believe that's not going to happen. So,
well, I hope so.
The upshot of it sounds like, Michael, is that you're getting back to speed, and the future looks to me like there's still lots of Stevens guitars that are going to show up on people's doorsteps. They still may have to wait a while, but they're coming.
I hope so. And some guys call and they're startled and I said, well, part of that's because you want me to do it, Part of it is because, if you want this particular guitar, how many guys have you seen that have had that many of those Gibson Explorers in their arms at one time? It's experience. You're paying for something else.
Sure.
There's young kids and CNCs and stuff out there that do really accurate work. I find less designers that I admire, except when I go to Europe. I look at stuff over there. I'm more impressed with the guitar designers and stuff I see coming out of Europe than most of the stuff in the States. And mostly in the States, I fault pegheads, But there's good kids out there. They're trying and they're working. And I wish I had more time to tutor people or talk to people, but they're not around and hiring an apprentice or something. I don't know. I'd like to think more about that, but or maybe get out, and I've only done a couple of those Asia symposiums and did talks, and I'd like to do more of that, but then again, I'm a long way from an airport. So.
Well, here's the thing. I really wanted to take the extra time on this interview, and my sense is that this is going to be most of the show. And I think that this is an opportunity for a lot of people to hear a lot of stuff about Michael Stevens that they will have not been able to hear anyplace else. I mean, I know you've done a lot of interviews and you've been around a long time, but I'm really, really grateful that you took this time and that we could present something really in depth to our listeners who really take this stuff seriously and are really interested in people of your stature, and you have stature, my friend. So I'm well.
I hope I didn't skip over something or blab on too long.
Well, listen, there's always editing, but there's not much that's going to be edited out. Except maybe a cough or something like that. But I have a hunch that we're going to have to do this again down the road and kind of catch up a little bit. But we're right at the cusp right now. So I'm just going to thank you so much for coming on and wish you the best. And we're going to keep an eye on things and be excited to see what comes next.
Well, I was happy to talk. I can just, the cat doesn't say much, so I get somebody on the phone. I want to blab on, and I think about it every once in a while. That Alice was always wanting me to sit down with the tape, and I did it some for a customer a while back, and just sit down and let your mind go and think of details and things. And if there's any holes in this, you can call me back up and we'll fill it in real quick.
Well, we're gonna do some more things down. We got a lot of things going on here at our company, Guitar Business Media. I've told you we've got some stuff coming out soon, so we're going to do a few more things. We'll be talking to you again, and again, I want to thank you for coming on, and we'll talk again real soon, Michael.
Okay, Jeffrey, I enjoyed it.
You bet.
All right.
For 19 episodes now, we've presented this segment called The Value Shot at the end of the show. In the magazine business, we always called it back of the book stuff. And I suppose there's probably a similar term in the podcast world, but for the moment, I'm afraid it escapes me. I've said on many occasions that this show is in many ways organic in nature, meaning it is constantly evolving and changing. But that just means we're always looking for ways to make it better. And there's no rule that says we have to stay the same. I say all that because this is the last segment of the Value Shot here on GBR. That doesn't mean it may not appear somewhere else at some point. It may. But for now, we're going to complete this chapter and move on to the next. And starting with episode 20, which, as I said earlier in the show, is kind of a milestone for us, we'll have something different in this block on the show going forward. But there will still be an editorial and opinion-oriented component to it, and I always like to end the show on a positive note, at least for those of you who make it to the end of the show. I'm under no illusion, of course, that it's 100% of you, but we certainly strive for that. And for those of you who have listened consistently to the Value Shot, you've gotten a lot of valuable information and ideas you can use in your daily activities. Of course, that's just my opinion because, well, they've been valuable to me and useful to me on a very regular basis. However, your results obviously may vary. Gotta say that. Now, one thing I can tell you is that even though this segment may be called something else, we will still be focused in many ways on the idea of value. Our goal is always to be informative, educational, enlightening, enjoyable, and all that sort of thing. But above all else, we're about value. Value is an integral part of business. Without it, you have no business. As a listener, participant, advertiser, or any other stakeholder, you must get some kind of value in one form or another from the experience, or you won't come back. We are dedicated to providing that value. And as we move forward with new ventures, these values, along with an emphasis on innovative thinking, creative presentation, and thoughtful and meaningful service, will be the foundation that this enterprise sets on. So stay tuned for some new and exciting stuff coming your way from Guitar Business Media. Don't hesitate to contact us with any questions or thoughts you may have about any of this, because we always love to hear from you. So thanks for listening, and remember to stay positive, stay focused on the destination, and keep all your options open on how you're going to get there. And I'll definitely see you on episode 20. And that's it for this episode of Guitar Business Radio. Thanks for being with us. You can stay tuned and stay in touch at guitarbusinessradio.com.